War. War never changes.
Fallout 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. I know it's become popular to dump on Bethesda these days, but it's sort of impossible to overstate how revolutionary this game was when it first came out. It offered an even deeper role-playing experience than the studio's previous efforts, and the post-apocalyptic Capital Wasteland felt like a breath of fresh air in a genre dominated by high fantasy. And with Fallout 3 turning 15 later this year, I thought now was the perfect time to revisit it. This pasty Adonis is our hero, Tim Tam. Well, protagonist. Hero might be a bit of a stretch considering the guy's a pacifist. You see, Tim Tam's aversion to violence began way back on his 10th birthday. All Tim Tam wanted to do was eat sweet rolls, read his new comic book, and enjoy his party. But instead, his father forced him to slaughter an innocent rat roach like some sort of primitive man-beast. Tim Tam would harbor a deep resentment towards his father over this, and it certainly didn't help matters when a few years later, the old bastard slipped out in the middle of the night for a pack of smokes and left Vault 101 without telling anybody, leaving poor Tim Tam to deal with the mess he left behind. However, the incident with the rad roach would also teach Tim Tam a very valuable lesson. Being a man isn't about having the strength to fight or kill. Being a man is about using your will to influence others to fight or kill for you. Or in some cases, just convincing your childhood bully he's better off leaving his mom to die. See, Butch, if you would just let him enjoy his sweet roll in peace, none of this would have happened, so you did this to yourself. After being inexplicably rejected by Amada for one final time, Tim Tam would escape the confines of Vault 101 and emerge into the Capital Wasteland. He would quickly adapt to his new life as his first instinct was to do some looting in the nearby town of Springvale. Following this, Tim Tam made his way to the pile of junk known as Megaton and sold some of his goodies to the traveling merchant Crazy Wolfgang. Tim Tam's pacifism would have its benefits. As it turns out, it's pretty easy to make some quick caps in the wasteland when you don't have any use for the weapons that you will inevitably come across. It was then time for Tim Tam to head into town and make friends with the locals.
You so much as breathe wrong, and I'm gonna fucking end ya.
The town sheriff was apparently really insecure about his hat and didn't have any information about dear old dad, so Tim Tam popped into the local saloon where he questioned the horror Nova. And that's not a judgmental statement about her character, she literally partakes in man's oldest profession.
Looking's free. The rest will cost ya.
Nova points Tim Tam to the owner of the joint, Colin Moriarty, and Moriarty claims he does indeed possess the information Tim Tam seeks, but will only share it if Tim Tam helps him deal with the problem he's having with one of his former employees.
Junkie bitch named Silver borrowed quite a few caps from me.
See, that's a judgmental statement about someone's character. Unless Junkie Bitch is a job title I'm unaware of, in which case I apologize. Once he wraps up his conversation with Moriarty, Tim Tam is then beckoned by the mysterious Mr. Burke, who offers to pay him to blow up Megaton. The caps are tempting, but being directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds does go directly against his pacifist beliefs. Still, seeking an opportunity to create chaos, Tim Tam accepts the job, then turns around and raps out Mr. Burke to the sheriff.
You're about to get an education in wasteland justice.
I know.
After this incident, there's a new sheriff in town.
Hello to you.
Also, in between his discussions with Burke and Sims, Tim Tam did run into an old raider named Jericho, who's interested in joining up with the kid, but sadly Tim Tam was unable to afford his hefty recruitment fee. With a newfound need for caps, Tim Tam locates Silver and is able to convince her to hand over everything she owes, nice and peaceful like. However, as soon as she turns her back, Tim Tam reveals his klepto tendencies and steals what little else she has of value. With his mission complete, Tim Tam returns to Moriarty's, but he has no intention of handing over the caps, and instead hacks into Moriarty's personal computer to learn that his dad has apparently headed off for Galaxy News Radio. Tim Tam originally intended to use some of his ill-gotten profits to rent a room for the night until he learns of the outrageous rates they're charging. So instead, he picks up a job from Lucy West to deliver a message to her family in the settlement of Arafu, then opts to hang about outside Craterside Supply all night like a wino camped outside the LQ. In the morning, Tim Tam introduces himself to Moira, the owner of Craterside Supply, who asks if he's willing to help her with a book she's working on, and as she's willing to pay, Tim Tam's willing to accept. One of her first requests is for Tim Tam to get himself afflicted with a healthy amount of radiation sickness so she can study the effects, and given that there's an undetonated atomic bomb that sits in the center of town, it seems like the perfect place to start.
Oh, you're a peach. Or at least some sort of hardy fruit that grows in the savagely irradiated mockery of agriculture we have nowadays.
Urged on by the ramblings of a deranged priest, Tim Tam would drink deep from the radiant waters of Adam, filling his belly with its glowy goodness, and when he began to get a little lightheaded and queasy, he powered through and downed some more. After all, what's one man suffering in the pursuit of science? He would then return to Moira, who was able to heal him of his radiation poisoning, although it turns out that drinking unfiltered bomb water might have long-lasting effects.
But it seems to be benign, at least.
Tim Tam would then decide to do some exploring, and this is when he would encounter his first true threats. First in the form of mole rats, although these are quickly followed up by some vicious dogs. Luckily, the trader that had stopped off outside Megaton was able to lend a hand. Further away from town, Tim Tam learns more about the dangers of the Capital Wasteland as he witnesses a scavenger get mauled to death by a rad scorpion. It's not all bad news though, as he is able to use the rad scorpion to distract the pack of dogs that had been hounding him, and is even able to strip the deceased scavenger of his goodies before slipping away. Tim Tam would eventually stumble across the small town of Andale. Aside from the fact that everybody seemed oblivious to the fact that they were living in an apocalyptic hellscape, the residents all seemed nice enough. Well, except for this one kid who wouldn't quit whining about the fact that he was going to be forced to marry his cousin. There was also this one old man who was convinced that it was secretly a town full of killers. Tim Tam was curious to look into this, but lacking any backup, he decides it's probably best to avoid intentionally poking any hornet's nests for the time being. A short time after this, Tim Tam is attacked by a raider, but a man called Rococo Rockefeller makes the save. Tim Tam learns that Rococo is a member of a group called the Outcast, who apparently have beef with something called the Brotherhood of Steel. None of this really concerns Tim Tam, but he is able to negotiate an arrangement with their leader to trade any tech he salvages. With the need for a wingman becoming more and more apparent, he heads for Airfood to deliver Lucy's letter and hopefully receive his payment. However, upon arriving, Tim Tam nearly has his head blown off by the lookout Evan King. King informs Tim Tam that Airfood has been dealing with trouble from a local gang called the Family, and asks him to check on the three families that live in town. The first two are perfectly fine, but when Tim Tam arrives at the West residence, he quickly discovers that Lucy's family have been the victims of a grisly murder. Which sucks, because now it means there's not anybody to compensate Tim Tam for coming out to this pit stop they're trying to pass off as a town. Not wanting to rush into anything, he decides to recenter his energy with a quick nap before he tells King what he's found. King informs Tim Tam that Lucy has a brother named Ian, who may still be alive, and asks Tim Tam to search for him, giving Tim Tam 3 locations to investigate. While Tim Tam isn't happy about being sent off on a wild goose chase, his need to be paid outweighs his displeasure, so he agrees. Hoping to avoid any raiders or dogs that may have been lurking nearby, Tim Tam jumps off the bridge and plunges into the murky depths of the waters below. The good news is that he does manage to find some medical supplies stashed on a shipwreck. The bad news is that Mirelurks are in the area, and when they make quick work of the Enclave Eyebot that try to lend a hand, Tim Tam decides it's a good time to make his exit. He arrives at Moonbeam Cinema, but the only thing waiting for him are some super mutants, and sadly they don't seem to have any interest in taking on the mole rats or Mirelurks that would pop up a short time later. Tim Tam then flees to Hamilton's hideout, but it doesn't take long at all to realize they have the rad scorpion infestation, so he quickly nopes out of there. The last spot on the list is Northwest Seneca Station. When he arrives, Tim Tam meets a cool ghoul named Murphy, who asks if Tim Tam is willing to sell any boxes of sugar bombs he comes across to help him with his production of Ultrajet. He initially tries to lowball Tim Tam and offers only 15 caps a box, but Tim Tam was able to talk him up to 30. After all, who could say no to that face? Tim Tam heads a little deeper into the station, but almost immediately runs into another Mirelurk and decides it's probably a good idea to put this job off until later. It was becoming more and more apparent that most of the assholes that inhabited the Capital Wasteland did not share Tim Tam's non-violent beliefs. So looking to score some quick caps, Minefield became his primary destination, as Moira had earlier informed him that recovering mines can prove to be a reliable source of income. When Tim Tam arrives, he quickly gets to work cleaning up the neighborhood of its explosive debris, although the current resident makes it abundantly clear that he does not appreciate these efforts. So Tim Tam breaks into a nearby house and catches a quick nap to heal his crippled limbs, also looks around to see if the place has any sugar bombs, but it doesn't turn out to be his lucky day. He then heads back outside and makes his way to the center of town, and makes a mental note of the asshole that kept taking pot shots at him.
You just made the list!
It's then time to begin the long voyage back to Megaton, and by the time he arrives, it's the middle of the night, so he's once again forced to loiter outside Crater-Sized Supply until morning. When the store finally opens, Tim Tam reports his success back to Moira and agrees to check out a nearby Super Duper Mart to see if it still contains any food or medicine. However, he puts that on the back burner for the moment and sells Moira many of the mines he had brought back, as well as numerous other goodies. However, when she runs out of money, Tim Tam is forced to deal with some of Megaton's other shopkeepers, although eventually he is able to raise the 1,000 caps that Jericho had said he needed for supplies. He tracks down the X-Raider at Moriarty's saloon, and the two hash out the terms of a partnership. The investment in Jericho's services quickly proves promising, as he's able to mow down mole rats and dogs without breaking a sweat. Tim Tam soon decides to have Jericho test himself against more worthy foes. The first stop is Andale. The two wait until nightfall, then break into the Wilson's house and take the keys to his shed, as well as his scoped Magnum. They also stop by Jack Smith's place to take the sawed-off shotgun that he was holding off his hands. Tim Tam investigates the shed and uncovers a bunch of human skeletons and fridges filled with strange meats. When Tim Tam and Jericho exit the shed, they're confronted by most of the adults in town, who ask Tim Tam what he thinks about his new discovery. Their tendency of eating people doesn't really bother Tim Tam, but if they were all dead, it would make it a lot easier to check their houses for sugar bombs. So he gives Jericho the order to open fire, and it's an absolute massacre. Old Man Harris thanks the two for dealing with his demented offspring and fills them in on Andale's rich history of incest and cannibalism. Once he's finally finished his rambling, it's finally time to check the newly vacant houses for those sweet, sweet sugar bombs. Turns out there's not a single box to be found though, which makes sense, with hindsight, although there are plenty of useful tools lying around. The next stop is the Super Duper Mart, although on the way the pair do run into a lone Enclave soldier who Jericho is easily able to dispatch of. Tim Tam does not hesitate to claim the dead man's power armor, which he happily bestows upon Jericho. Almost immediately after this, they'd run into a group of wannabe tough guys calling themselves the Regulators, who inform Tim Tam there's a bounty on his head that they intend to collect, but with his new suit of power armor, they don't stand a chance against Jericho. The duo then arrive at the Super Duper Mart, although it's pretty obvious that somebody else has called dibs on it first and made it abundantly clear they aren't very welcoming of newcomers. Tim Tam had originally intended to sneak his way through the supermarket, although Jericho quickly lets it be known that he does not agree with this course of action. After locating both food and medicine, it's then back to Megaton to fill Moira in on their findings and trade some goodies. He also realizes that the people at Moriarty's still haven't cleaned up the corpse of Lucas Sims, so Tim Tam takes it upon himself to pay the proper respects. With that taken care of, it was time to head back to Minefield. Jericho would somehow manage to force the sniper from out of his nest, and when the two were on equal footing, the coward would prove to be no match for Tim Tam's bloodthirsty sidekick. Following their escapades in Minefield, Tim Tam would return to Fort Independence to trade with the outcast, and shortly after this, would stumble upon a small grocery store that actually had a few boxes of sugar bombs lined up amongst the detergent. On the way to sell them to Murphy, Tim Tam would run to a scavenger, and the two would barter for a bit before some Mirelurks would show up looking for a fight. Tim Tam, Jericho, and the scavenger would all manage to escape the encounter relatively unharmed, but the scavenger's dog wasn't nearly as lucky. When Tim Tam makes it to Murphy's, he learns that the family is indeed hiding out deeper in the tunnels before selling off all of his sugar bombs. Jericho would deal with the Mirelurks that had scared Tim Tam off before, and when Tim Tam arrives at the family's compound, he's able to arrange a meeting with their leader Vance. Vance asks Tim Tam to study their laws, and in doing so, Tim Tam learns that they follow the code of the vampire. Tim Tam could not care less about any of this, and satisfied with his apathy, Vance decides that he's not a threat and agrees to allow him to speak with Ian West. Ian decides to return to Arafu and just put the fact that he's a burgeoning cannibal who killed his parents behind him after reading the letter from Lucy. Tim Tam strikes up a deal with Vance to protect Arafu in exchange for blood packs, then informs him of Ian's decision. Evan King agrees to the family's offer, and when Tim Tam returns to tell Vance, he's so thrilled he offers to teach Tim Tam the ways of the vampire. Tim Tam happily accepts and expresses his gratitude the only way he knows how, stealing everything of value that's not bolted down. With some caps in his pocket and a loyal follower by his side, Tim Tam decides it's finally time to get some answers out of dear old dad and heads for Galaxy News Radio. When Tim Tam and Jericho arrive in DC proper, they are quickly set upon by a couple of mutants, although they receive an assist from Paladin Lions and the Brotherhood of Steel. As they're also headed for GNR, it seems like a good idea to tag along and have Jericho lend a hand. Everything was just going swimmingly until a super mutant behemoth showed up to crash the party. Acting fast, Tim Tam retrieved a Fat Man from a dead Brotherhood of Steel member and gave it to Jericho along with a couple of mini nukes. Turns out all he needed was the one though, as he takes out the behemoth with a perfectly placed shot. And that seems like a pretty good place to call it. Hey everybody, Dusty here, and I hope you've all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, well then what the hell are you still doing here? But if you did enjoy it, then leave a like and think about subscribing to the channel to be kept up to date with all my latest content. As always, thanks for watching.